So the next session is looking at lessons for research. We have Ross McLennan, Pro Vice-Chancellor Research Services, Macquarie University, and Jason Lodge. Jason, you wear many hats. He'll be known to many of you. I've written educational technologist and psychological scientist. There's plenty of there's plenty of other titles and hats that go with that. He's recently co-written with colleagues an AI framework for Australian universities. He's also very interested in AI and its application to education. Jana, you've done work in that area from the Ukrainian context. So there's some, and Jason spending most of a year looking at international comparisons and other issues. So there's great points there. We were also going to be joined by Gemma Lucy Smart, who is the chair of CAPA, but she is unable to join us, unfortunately. So I was going to ask Richard to join us in case Gemma may appear. It is possible that she will appear. She's unfortunately in hospital as we speak. But if she is freed by the hospital, she has promised to come straight here. She is a great voice and advocate for students, as is Richard. So without further ado, the focus here is on research. There's so much to go into based on what we've heard from the Ukrainian experience this morning. Ross, I want to start with you. Does national interest trump potential research breakthroughs when it comes to international collaboration?
First of all, let me check. Yeah, there we go. That's on. That's a really interesting question, and thanks, Tim, for the invitation to be here, and thank you for the guests from Ukraine. That was a really insightful and inspiring morning, very thought-provoking. When I think about that topic, I always come back to something which was really clearly articulated in the UFIT guidelines, so the University's Foreign Interference Task Force around countering foreign interference, in that the primary driver is to make sure that we create an environment where international collaboration and research collaboration is supportive, that our walls can continue to be down and our borders continue to be open, so that we can continue to drive forward research in all of its guises. And as we heard from our Ukrainian colleagues this morning, it's that international collaboration and ability to connect with other people which is critically important. However, we're in a world and a political situation where it's increasingly required upon us to make sure that we're making good decisions. So that's where, due diligence is not just something which we need to do at the end. It's really factoring that into sort of being a key strategic decision-making tool that leaders have. But we're always thinking about what's the right thing to do, how we can build that environment for doing research successfully, and doing that in a way which is clearly documented, that we're taking those steps so that we can provide that support and that surety that we can carry on to push the boundaries in terms of research collaboration. So that's a bit of a tortuous way to answer your question, Tim, but it's really, we need to make sure that we're looking at both of these things. It's very much a balancing act, and it's very much something that's hard work. It needs continued focus on so that we can continue to drive and to foster that collaboration, but in a way which is safe and protecting the natural assets of an institution and of a nation.
And just while you've got the microphone, I thought it'd be useful to talk a little bit more about the work that you've done over looking at the national interest, national security considerations in Australia when conducting research, because I think that's really relevant to this discussion.
Yeah. And thank you, Tim. First of all, I should note that those who were having lunch with me will know that I deliberately sat myself in the middle so I wouldn't get the microphone first. So I'd let my colleagues either side. So you've thwarted that plan. And this goes to give it too much thought. I was just going to pass the microphone from one to the other. But yeah, so I've been fortunate to be in the position to spend a lot of time talking to government and talking to colleagues across the sector and across the globe around research security, about countering foreign interference. And the things that sort of really come forward to me are having that, as I mentioned before, making sure that it's open first, and then putting in, open is the default, that we're open to collaboration, we're open to sharing ideas and working together to solve the world's tricky problems. But we have the ability to go deep and to look in exceptional circumstances, that we can look to collaborate. We can do that where we can say yes where we can, but we say no where we must. That we are clear around where the bright lines are. That in particular high technology areas where there's particular funding demands, there's particular concerns from government and from industries to keep that knowledge close, which may be for a national security perspective, it may be because it's from our institutional perspective, intellectual property, which is particularly important and valuable for growing our research and our teaching agenda. But we have those clear lines around that, so we can spend our time thinking about the more nuanced cases, that we can look at where we can find ways to make things happen, that we can put in place the right mitigation to allow that to happen. And if I look around the globe, there's different examples, but all around the same case. That the US has a very prescriptive approach, that if you're getting more than a certain amount of federal income in particular areas, you need to demonstrate that you've got an office which is focused on research security, and you've got the policies and procedures to be able to grow that. The UK has a very playbook model in terms of trusted research. They have some guidelines from that they're working through different elements. In some ways, they're following on from what Australia is doing with UFIT and having that collaborative model. And then Canada is another great example where there's very clearly published rules from government that if you're going to do these types of research activities, then you cannot work with these types of institutions. So that clarity. So I think the challenge which we have here is to embed that due diligence early in ideation, to work really closely about thinking about how those things can happen, and to draw on all those different skills and experiences. But again, I keep coming back to the fact that whilst I spend a lot of time telling people maybe that's not what they want to do and they want to think of a different thing, that comes from a place of trying to create that environment, that safe space where we can work across those boundaries.
I want to jump for a second from those issues of research security and national security to the reality of universities. Over the past year, we've had numerous substantial data hacks at Australian institutions, which is precisely the same issue that they're dealing with in Ukrainian universities, where data has to be kept safe. And in Ukraine, it's a matter of life and death. Here, it's certainly not treated as a matter of life and death. How are we going with data security in reality?
It's my microphone now, gents. You'll have to squabble over another one. Cybersecurity is front and center. I mean, again, if I look at this from the perspective of what does government tell us in the sector is important, it's around the risks of foreign interference, and it's the risks of or the need for cybersecurity. And data is incredibly important, not only from that foreign interference perspective, but the data is life. Data is really how universities work and how research can move forward. And it's incredibly important to make sure that we have the provenance around the data, that we have the safety around that, not just from a perspective of it not falling into the hands of somebody you don't want it to fall into, but so that we as researchers can clearly articulate the background for that data. And the stories we were hearing from Ukraine around having to move and not have that archival data, or only being able to access what you'd put in the cloud, sort of really drives that. I'll be going back to my institution, reminding people that we have data management plans so that you know where your data is. And maybe leaving it until next month to do your monthly update of the data that you've collected is not a good way of doing it. Hopefully we never have that immediacy of needing to move on, but you can never tell what's going to happen. And that might not be occupation, it might not be war, but it might be the pipe bursting in your office and ruining your computer. And if that's the machine that's got your data on it, that's incredibly important. So all of those things sort of come together, and it's having that holistic approach that data is the lifeblood of research, and the time and efforts and the approvals that are put in place to collect it. You shouldn't be disregarding that by not making sure you've got that really clear path for how you can take that forward. And that's not just a national security issue, that's really just to make sure that we can keep research moving forward.
Richard, do you want to have some thoughts from a student perspective? A number of students have raised concerns about the data breach. All you have to do is look online in relation to any news story about data breaches last year, and you'll see many concerns from students about their personal data being revealed.
Yep, I think that in terms of Like, I think we all agree that privacy and data is important for students. I would hope that we all agree on that point. I think that, like, for university to be able to inspire confidence for the community, we need to make sure that the students are comfortable with sharing, like, both their research data but also personal data. But I would also like to link back to what we were talking about earlier on. Like, a lot of those data breaches have to do with a lot of the well-being data that the university have collected. And those are things that will impact students for the rest of their lives if they are leaked. And so the sector really needs to take this seriously because, for us to continue to um, have that social license to operate, to be a sustainably developing sector, we really need to find a way to earn that trust back from our community.
All right, Jason, you look like you want to move on, so let's move on to.
Oh yeah, cybersecurity stuff.
Let's move on to something which is near and dear to you: AI, technology, and its application in better education outcomes. It's been critical in the Ukrainian experience. Tell us what you found in 5 minutes.
Oh boy, where to start? I should recognise that I know this wasn't your intention, Tim. It's slightly uncomfortable being on such a dudish panel. I think I just invented an adjective then. But I understand that wasn't the intention. All right. So that being said, I think all of the issues that we've discussed so far, I think, become greatly exacerbated when it comes to AI. So if we think about, international sharing and learning from each other, every education sector in the world is grappling with what to do about AI right now. And there are vastly different approaches to this across different countries, everything from embedding it everywhere in places like Estonia to not going anywhere near it, which is sort of where I think a lot of the Nordic countries are starting to head, where they're sort of saying EdTech out altogether of schooling. So I think we need to be able to learn from each other because that we desperately need to understand what the impact of this new technology is as fast as possible because it's evolving so quickly. Some of you will be aware that the distance between when research is often done in education about how learning might work with technologies and when that actually impacts on policy and practice, the gap is about 17 years. Now, if anybody thinks we've got 17 years to figure all this out, that's why we need to be able to work across borders and work together to try and figure this out across different contexts. From there, I think the data issue, of course, is then also greatly exacerbated by AI. I mean, who knows what these systems are going to be able to do with data that we don't necessarily want them to have. Many of them are built on data that we didn't necessarily want them to have. I think that this technology in particular creates such a complex set of issues on top of what we were dealing with already. People will argue, there's some sort of AI bubble or various other things going on at the moment. But I think fundamentally, whatever your view is about what this technology is and how it works, it has changed our relationship to machines, right? People didn't fall in love with Wikipedia pages, right? They were not saying that Google was their companion. And we're already seeing now with adolescents in particular that many of them, the primary reason that they use AI is for companionship. Now, that probably says that something's not right. Exactly. That's true though. Something's not quite right here, but there is a fundamental change in the way that we interact with machines that exacerbates everything that I think we've talked about thus far.
And just to build on that, one thing which, and you might know the answer to this, but if I think about sort of cybersecurity, that often the conversations I have are around, really clear breaches where, a hacker has come in and has taken some data, and maybe that's student data or wellbeing data, maybe that's research data, but that's sort of the area of focus. It's we've got it in our container and someone's coming into our container and taking our data away and doing what they want with it. My unanswered question in my mind is that in terms of how we're using AI, as policy is always going to be chasing the rapid rate of change of the technology here, are we creating our own problem but without being aware of it? There are still people who are putting things into AI tools to answer questions or to help with their research, and the genie's out of the bottle there. They're taking their idea, they're putting it in there, but we're doing our own cyber hacking. There's nobody who's there who's doing anything illegal and wrong with that data, but we're creating a repository. But at some point, when we want to have wished we hadn't done it and kept it in our container, it's already too late. So I don't know how we're sort of willingly walking down that path as guidelines are often rushing to catch up with the reality.
I'll pass the microphone around if anyone has questions as we're going.
Then can make my question about data. Then we speak about the data and its protection, open science, stands in the other side. Yes, and Europe and Ukraine have adopted a clear course. Everything should be clear, data, publications, and research outputs. But at the same time, last year, the Draghi report agreed that openness has endowment innovation, with startups relocating from Europe to US. And what is the situation in the with open science in Australia? And do you also find yourselves moving towards that extremes?
I can actually. Yeah. I'm going to wind back a little bit to get to the open science things. Many people in the room will be familiar that there is this movement around open science, which is to increase transparency around the whole research process, because traditionally what we've done is we see the end result in a research paper and we have very little insight into the rest of that process. So there has been quite a bit of a movement in Australia around open science, but it tends to happen in certain disciplinary areas. So it's sort of happening in pockets rather than anywhere else. I think psychology was particularly heavily impacted. So there's quite a lot of work in psychology, and in other kind of areas, there's a strong philosophy of science group who are also working on transparency around research. I think it's a really vital part of the picture here. As a former journal editor, I can say with absolutely no doubt whatsoever that there is misconduct that is rife in the area that I was working in, not just the things like p-hacking, which is just collecting data until you find what you think you want to find. There was a lot of that, but I'm pretty sure there was just straight out data fabrication going on, publishing cartels, the lot. This probably isn't a surprise to many people in the room. The system that we currently have allows some of this behaviour to happen. So I fully agree. I think that open science is a really important step towards making much more of the research process transparent. I think it's something we have to do, because I can see that these problems are going to be, again, only going to be greatly exacerbated by AI. If you want to come up with a believable data set, you know, the powerful AI model will be able to do it for you in 2 seconds, right? So then write the publication for you and the whole thing becomes, you know, something that didn't ever actually happen. So yes, any move towards increased transparency, I think, is vital here. And I'd like to see, I would like to think, and I would like to hope that we'd moved a bit faster, but we're getting there and it's a long journey in Australia. I think it's probably fair.
And in terms of that, you know, the AI production of research and images, you know, over the last 5-6 years, there's been this growth in data sleuths, people who spend their time looking at images and identifying where there's possible fabrication or falsification, which is, you know, created then, you know, posed the question, which has then been able to dug into and to identify, you know, what's accidental, what's deliberate, and so on and so forth. But just a couple of weeks ago, I was hearing Elizabeth Bick, one of the well-known people in this space, and she was saying, you know, she, as an expert in her field, because of AI, she can't tell what's fabricated anymore. So there's just so much information around there that there's images which are going to be potentially being produced, which we don't know whether that's accurate or whether that's false. So I think that's as one particular area. But as I think about the, you know, universities without walls concepts, and as Jana, you were saying there's different jurisdictions have different rules around open science and around protection of data and all these different elements and the use of AI. And what my institution thinks is normal will be different from anyone else's institution thinks is normal as we're developing these policies. So then when I layer on top of that in my mind a world where you know, members of a university are spending significant time working in different jurisdictions and sort of building those collaborations and sort of working with pockets of excellence and infrastructure. But what may be normal practice for a colleague who, you know, wears the same logo as me from a university, using AI might be accepted there in terms of using it in a particular way, but that's contrary to our institutional policies or what we've established as a nation as being the norms. So there's a piece of work to be done there around what's the ethical floor, what's the standard across different areas which we want to be able to accept, so that you know that if you're moving to a different area, a different geography, that you know what the baseline is, so that we can have that surety again as to what's real research and how to use AI in a way which is safe and productive. Because the potential from the tool is enormous in terms of helping to identify areas to develop methodology, but we don't want it to be doing research, and we certainly don't want it to be making up the data which has never existed in the first place.
Richard, I'm going to go to you again. I love the opportunity to just hear your thoughts from within CAPA or from your own experience. Are our guidelines for AI use for students, particularly postgraduate students, are they right? Do we have enough information? Is there a lot of confusion out there?
Absolutely not. Excuse me. So even within our university, our great university, different faculties, different schools have different understanding of how we interact with AI, which becomes really confusing. And I think that, Jason, you came to one of the University Senate sessions last year, or was it the year before? Wow. Just to explain what AI actually means to the people who are making decisions on the policies, right? I think that as a sector, we actually, on top of grappling with all these new technology, we actually don't have enough education and training for our executives and our council or Senate members on a coherent strategy of how to implement and embed AI into our university system. And that causes chaos everywhere. That causes chaos with our academics. As a casual academic, sometimes I don't know which course I'm allowed to introduce AI to students, and let alone being a student, how would they know what type of AI is appropriate? So it is definitely a sector-wide challenge, and it's not something that we could just make it up as we go. We kind of need a better focus group and a more coherent strategy.
Can I just ask, further on from that, how is this impacting people trying to finish their PhD right now or their masters?
Well, look, I think PhD is messy, just as it is without AI. It's definitely impacting them, and I think that particularly for international students, from countries that don't have a big research culture, even the coursework content is becoming a little bit confusing. Some of the times you see students from particularly East Asian countries, they misuse AI and then get in trouble, but they weren't told otherwise, right? The university didn't come up with a coherent policy or workshop to tell them that, hey, this is the correct and ethical way to implement and use AI. And then these students get expelled, and then from a student association point of view, you're kind of we want to help you, but you did break the university policies you didn't know about, but you still broke it. So it has significant impact on the completion of students, but on top of that, it adds another layer of stress, because they just don't know what to do, and frustration.
Thank you. Stephen, you've got a question over here.
I've got a question about something a bit differently. This morning, I was fascinated by our Ukrainian colleagues who are obviously both eminent scholars in your own home disciplines, but then had sort of shifted into new research questions that seemed really urgent. How do universities adapt in the face of such sort of incredible transitions? How do our individual, our staff and students, how resilient are they? So I guess my question to the panel is, how do we support our universities and our university researchers, including research students, to think about the questions we most need to answer now? Now, Barney Glover kind of talked about that a bit, and the third paper does around mission-based research. But of course, we also want to make sure that the things that we don't know how they're urgent right now have the space. So I guess from each of your perspectives, how do you think about the rallying people around the most urgent questions versus, keeping the scope open for the things that will be urgent down the track?
It's a great question. I think for me personally, the biggest piece of the puzzle has always been good people to work with. Because I think whatever the complex problem is that we might be dealing with, we're going to potentially have multiple disciplines that are attacking that problem from different perspectives. So, although I've spent a lot of time thinking about AI for the last 3 years, my bit of that puzzle and the bit that I've always done is about learning. So I'm always coming back to the learning. You heard from Mitch before that his PhD was in neural net models and the philosophy. I don't know what that perspective is, but I can ask him, and then we can try and figure it out together. So, I have a lab team. There are 15 people in my lab, and that's the kind of thing that I encourage them to do, to the point where I have one of my PhD students is in philosophy. I've got 2 in computer science, and I think it's through that collaboration that we can start to grapple with these really complex, kind of urgent issues that come up. The thing that I often see where that tends to go wrong, and this is not to pick on any discipline in particular, but sometimes certain people have a certain view of the world from their discipline. It's like, oh yeah, we can solve this problem by doing X, not realizing that another discipline had been grappling with the same problem for 100 years, right? So, but when you bring those viewpoints together, I think that that's enormously powerful. And I think the more that we can do that, the more we can get those perspectives on some of these complex problems.
And you mentioned Barney Glover in your question, Amanda, and I think he also sort of hinted at part of the solution in there is the importance of humanities. I mean, I think we'll all agree here that AI. Let's take AI as an example. If it's just for computer scientists who are working on that challenge and not thinking about the social license of it, the legal ramifications of it, the philosophy of what we want it to do, the ethics of what we want to do, we're going to create a really cool tool that either nobody wants or is completely out of control. And neither of those things is a good outcome. So the question then becomes, so I agree, as Jason said, it's about bringing the right people together to be able to have that conciliant approach, to be able to identify that outcome. But then I think, how do we do that well at scale across a nation? And we will all be aware here that those of us in Australia that we've been waiting a long time for the son or daughter of ERA to come along. We no longer. It's been 2018 was the last time that we had a national review of the research so that we could all put ourselves top of whatever ranking table we wanted to do in terms of how we can twist the statistics. But one thing which would be really valuable from that approach, and something which I'll say to the ARC whenever I'm in the room with them, is to be able to look at the areas that the nation thinks is very important, and then to look across all of our universities and identify where our gaps are, where we can bring people together, where there's potential duplication, so that we can have a sensible conversation around where we want to focus that. And I think that's an area which is incredibly useful, that the next generation be much more flexible, and rather than just looking at excellence within institutions, it's looking at excellence across institutions and pockets of where things can happen, so that UQ can have a particular AI focus, but then the people who are focusing the ethics of AI are in a different area, but we join them up and we have that connected approach, that we're not all trying to compete to do the same thing. We're taking that national approach because 40 odd universities, it's not huge. We heard before that many universities were displaced in Ukraine over the last 12 years, that we're a relatively small community. We should be working even more collaboratively together, but we're lacking the data to be able to identify where those gaps, overlaps, opportunities are.
I think that I'm going to say something that that students are allowed to say, probably the university sector probably won't. I think that we need to radically redesign our curriculum. I think that we need to focus more on transdisciplinary knowledge. And I think that we need to have more emphasis on the theory of knowledge in our curriculum. Now, we see this happening in the secondary space already, like, and the primary space even. You have like, international education systems like the International Baccalaureate that looks at that transdisciplinary knowledge. You also have Montessori looking at, the curiosity and inquiry-based learning. So why can't we do that at the university level? Like, it's really important to try and build the different knowledge together so that our students can understand in the future they're going to face issues that we can't even dream of right now. So it's about providing them with the capacity now rather than dealing with the issue when it comes up in the future. So that focus on the theory of knowledge and the different types of knowledge, including Indigenous knowledge, is probably somewhere that we need to put more emphasis on.
Thank you.
That's perfect timing, Ricky, because I was just going to pick up on this concept of knowledge, and Ross, you said about getting the right people in the room. And I'm really interested in thinking through from Igor and Jan's presentation this morning, again, that idea about the ethics and the political and the existential nature of data and whose data, and thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty. So when we're thinking about all of these things and AI, how do Indigenous knowledges impact? And who actually gets to be the person who says what data is or isn't, and who gets to say what data should or shouldn't be used in these spaces? So it's a very broad general question, but I'm just wondering from all of your standpoints, the ethics of us as institutions and as data custodians, how do we reframe how we think about ourselves such that we take on board Indigenous knowledges, ways of thinking, being and doing in this moment?
It's a good question when the panelists look at one another and go, yeah. It's a really important question. And I'm not even going to pretend I'm anywhere close to an answer. And I think that I'll come to AI in a moment, but I think in the broad space of research ethics, I think we've already gone quite a way to looking at sort of Indigenous practices there and making sure that we've got the right decisions, that we've got the right protection of Indigenous cultural knowledge in contracts. I think we're doing that better than we have done. We've still got a huge way to go, and we need to be much more informed by what's already out there. In terms of AI, just talking to some colleagues in the space, I mean, it's even just thinking about the training material for those activities. It's very westernized, it's very male, it's very particularly focused and driven. And how to then bring that back from being skewed in that way is I don't know what the answer to that is, because it's just generating all the time. And I don't think, but from talking to Indigenous community groups, I don't think they want their knowledge to be in there. But it's how to then leverage the capability and power of tools like that in a way which can then help them as community groups to really understand what they've developed better, and to then leverage that for their own good without it being taken away. I don't have the technological knowledge to know how that can happen, but I certainly know that there is a commitment from various people to do that. But how we move it forward, I think that's something which we really need to wrestle with, and hopefully that's something that comes up in the conversations over the next couple of days. I'll pass to the AI expert who clearly has the answer.
Marie, do you want to say anything at this point, given we have an Indigenous person and a former Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra, Marie Meredith, here?
Thank you. Yeah.
You're probably well equipped to respond.
Yes. From my experience in having worked with traditional owners over many, many years, 20 plus years, I think there is a great opportunity here to work with knowledge holders, especially if we're looking at Indigenous knowledges being an oral tradition. I think there is great opportunity here. I think we can learn lessons from the intellectual property rights area. I think that's really, really important, especially in terms of Indigenous cultural knowledge and pharmaceutical knowledge. I think there's already work that's being done in this area that has been Indigenous led, right? So I think there has to be a more concerted effort to bring people that are already working in the space that to lead, I think, the next chapter for AI. It hasn't been done. There's a gap there. So I'm hoping that, there can be some leadership here in terms of the sector. But there are mobs out there that know their business, have been doing it for many years across sectors, and higher education needs to learn from those people. They are the traditional owners, they are the knowledge holders, but they also know what's right for them and their community. That's all I'll say.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, just on interdisciplinarity, I wanted to go back to your previous conversation. Are there international exemplars that you're looking at? I mean, I'm thinking of the German model of the excellence clusters, which bring together the PhD students and the postgrads. It happens in some context. Are you aware of models that could be implemented here?
I'm a student, so I don't have the answer to all the questions. But I do think that like some of the US universities, they started having this like learning journals, like learning passport style of approach. So it's not just about like being able to be an expert in one particular discipline, but you need to be able to engage with like multiple different disciplines before you're able to like pick one. And I'm actually really surprised that like we haven't done that yet in Australia, especially with the entry exams into like university. Even the way that we look at how high school students get into university, it's very much based on their ATAR. Like, you don't have, sure, you have like medicine where you do like interviews and panels before you get into the university, but they're actually not recognizing anything but like a score-based system, which is very focused on like disciplinary knowledge that are like cut and categorized. I don't know.
I think there's many different examples of where it can work, and it's what works best in a particular environment. 15 years ago, I was at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands, and they developed and launched the Maastricht Science Program. So this is just about science, but moving beyond the traditional model where as you leave high school, you decide whether you're going to do chemistry, physics, biology, and all the rest, just in case there's people who really like the subdisciplines. But, to create a program where for the first 2 or 3 years, it was all of them. And it was, it's like a liberal arts degree from the US. It's keeping that model so that people could then pick and choose. Then it got complicated in the last year because everybody had their own particular focus, and that required, modules and lectures to be brought from here, there, and the other. So I think there's ways of being able to do that and making sure that you have that approach where you're bringing the humanities in on a case-by-case basis. If I think about research, I mean, there's many models around the globe, the German model where they sort of create these institutes. But it comes down to, in my mind, whether this is a bricks and mortar game or whether it's just creating that environment and the culture for people to come together. And then I think that's where it's institutions and institutional leadership is incredibly important. And again, coming back to the Ukrainian example, people were dispersed and are dispersed around the globe, but creating a culture and a vibrancy and environment where the connection is not to walking down the boulevard, which has got all the right flags on and you've got the right messages wherever you go. It's feeling that you're part of a university, and that comes from intellectually coming together and thinking about where those questions are, and your research trajectory changing based on the circumstances and the opportunities where you can sort of play a different role. So it's how to create that, which is a hard game. It's a long, consistent cultural piece to be able to open people's minds and to have people working. And when talking about this and thinking about this, I often think of, I know of many people who are statisticians, and some of them are very much focused on their one bit of statistics, and that's their jam. Other people, they bring their skills to a whole range of different projects, and one day they'll be working on a medical problem, the next it'll be engineering, and next it'll be looking at, how to take low quality data from sort of surveys and be able to put the statistical control around that. So they're not p-hacking, but they're bringing that approach together. And it's that latter model which I don't have the answer, but again, I think that's where that institutional drive to be able to create an environment where people are confident that they can do that. And that's where, I was mentioning ERA before. ERA is a negative driver in that sense because people get drawn to disciplines, and I need to make sure that my discipline looks good because that's how I judge myself and how I get judged in an organization. So to create a world which is flexible and focused on doing good research, no matter who you're doing it with and how you're doing it.
We're getting close to time. Yes, one more question over the back.
Thank you. Love the interdisciplinary conversation. Kate Triglow from the University of Melbourne, where, as some people may know, we have a model which is really focused on broad education opportunities for undergraduate students. One of the challenges that sits in there, through my observation of students across a number of these degrees, is the level of independence that students necessarily need to bring into that space. And I feel that the more of these conversations that we have, the more we're asking students to take on a level of maturity for which they will also need support. So I'm kind of wondering about what perspectives people bring to that. AI opens up kind of infinite pathways, but choosing those pathways calls on the development of some values and decision-making that may need support.
So I think that in our undergraduate education course, we now talk about inquiry-based learning design. And I think that the crucial part about the inquiry-based learning design isn't that you have a question and then you say to the students, go and Google it. You know, that's not an inquiry-based learning practice. So I think that one thing, that there are two things that we need to acknowledge here. The first thing is that students are capable. Like, you know, they should have agency. They are perfectly well equipped to understand themselves, as well as be able to contribute and take leadership of their own learning. But on the other hand, you also have the challenge, as you mentioned, that university should have more, should have a better scaffold to help students make the decision that will benefit them the most. And I think the solution to that is surely student-staff partnership, right? Like the solution to that is surely like a co-design of a curriculum. Because when I used to teach grade 5 kids and we co-design a curriculum, and we're talking about grade 5 kids, like, you know, people who are not even teenagers, they can come up with the most creative ways to access knowledge with the right amount of prompt. So now if a 12-year-old could do it, so can a 19-year-old, right? So I think that we, on one hand, we need to be wary that to not set them up for failure. But on the other hand, we also need to release a little bit of the responsibility back to the students and provide them the opportunity to actually create something good with our community.
Great answer. I could see Jason itching to jump in.
Okay, this is a yes and, but I'm not as optimistic as you are, Ricky. I think going out, I've spent a lot of time over the last few years in the schools sector, and teachers are under a lot of pressure there, and they're getting pressure from all sorts of different directions, including to make sure that the kids that come out at the end of year 12 have good ATARs. And guess what? In almost every part of the country, apart from here in the ACT, in order to get a good ATAR, you have to perform well on an exam or multiple exams. And those exams are a type of knowledge regurgitation that doesn't always align with what we're doing in higher education, right? So we've moved to more blended models, more flexible, more active learning, which does require some sense of managing one's own learning. So the gap between what happens in secondary school and what we're doing in universities, I think, is growing. We've seen this manifesting in all sorts of different ways. Something that I think that brings together a few of the comments and topics that we've just talked about is, for me, I've sort of come back to this idea that something's working really well in early childhood, and there's a lot of exploration and kids learn how to kind of manage themselves. My own 2 kids have just gone through this experience. But as soon as they get to primary school, it's like NAPLAN, PISA, you know, right? And it's something's not quite right there. So to me, I think that there is something here about literacy, numeracy, and I always get this word wrong, epistemacy. So the good bits about what was in the critical thinking thing that was part of the 21st century skills stuff, right, which didn't quite work the way that we hoped it would, because here we are, AI's here, and now we need critical thinking again. There's something about explicitly understanding what knowledge is, how it works, what different knowledge frames you might have, different cultural knowledges, all of these things. Why aren't we teaching those things explicitly? Because they're so foundational to everything else that it should be treated as equal to literacy and numeracy, yet it's almost not touched at all. I think once you start to have that kind of situation in place where kids are being exposed to this in year one on, and the thread follows them all the way through, by the time they get to university, they're like, oh, okay, this is the way I think about things, but I can have a conversation with you because you're thinking about this thing from a different thing, and we can come up with a common language and figure it out. Whereas at the moment, that's often really hard. I find that hard. You know, working with computer scientists, it takes you 6 months to go, what are you actually talking about? I have this thing feedback and you're talking about feedback, but they're completely different things. So I think if we had a better foundation that kids were getting in terms of what is knowledge, how does knowledge work, what are different knowledge domains, what are different areas of knowledge and different ways of seeing the world, and then build from there, I think then we start to have a different conversation about a lot of these things.
Sorry, I think I completely agree, and at risk of sounding like I'm trying to promote international backccalaureate, like I think that yeah, they have like that they don't look at your discipline, just your disciplinary knowledge. They look at your ability to first of all contribute back to your community, and then the theory of knowledge, the extended essay on how you apply like your knowledge. And I think those are the skills that are missing in our current education system. Now, Jason sits next to my supervisor in our school, and that's what the School of Education actually promotes. Like, we have different types of like education, like theories and practice, but they are ultimately able to get together and discuss the differences. And I think that we should try and like extend that to the rest of the university community as well.
And I'm conscious of time, and Tim's looking at me. So we've got to where I wanted to be of just passing the microphone between these fantastic answers. But I just want to sort of call out one thing, and I agree with absolutely everything that's been said here. That want this to be a pitch for the IB, but the other thing that the IB has, as well as teaching people how to think, is that there is a significant component which is focused on that engagement with community. And I think that's what we need to get to. It's the ways of thinking. It's being able to have lots of different knowledge and discipline and to work across those different things, but to always be focused on what that means to our community. And I think that's the approach we need to get to.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that session. Ross, Jason, and Ricky, a brilliant session.